for Advanced Studies. I'm the director of the Museum School and the Adufer.
Any place I should sit?
Yes, please. My left. Yes, why not?
These are very royal seats.
Yeah. It's charming, no?
She wanted me to
Impressive.
sign this thing, I think.
Yeah, sure. This is for you.
I'll get a pen.
Boa tarde a todas e todos. Eu vou falar em inglês, mas quero, antes de começar, dizer a vocês que vai ter tradução simultânea e que os aparelhos estão lá na entrada. Se alguém precisar, por favor, busque os seus aparelhos, tá? Para tradução simultânea. E, claro, que poderão fazer as perguntas em português. Nós vamos conduzir em inglês, mas vocês podem fazer as perguntas em português. Well, thank you very much for being here. It's a great pleasure to receive my distinguished colleagues here, and it's also my profound pleasure to welcome you all as we introduce Professor Omer Bartov. Professor Bartov, who holds the Samuel Pisa Professorship of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University, stands among the most influential historians of mass violence and memory in our time. His intellectual contribution from dismantling the so-called myth of clean German army to the intricate microhistories of Galicia has reshaped our understanding of genocide, violence, and the fragile threats of human coexistence. But allow me, before grant him the floor, to frame his intellectual relevance within a broader reflection that is particularly dear to our tradition. We inherit from the Jewish legacy a profound tradition of debate and controversy. For centuries, the commentary on the book, the Torah, alongside the vast rabbinical interpretations, has taught us that disagreement is not a fracture. Rather, it is an ethical and epistemic method, a means of refining understanding, revealing ambiguities, and sustaining plurality. We argue for the text, within the text, and through the text. This written tradition carries dissent, interpretation, and contradiction across generations. It preserves disputes and obliges us to return to difficult questions. In doing so, controversy becomes a safeguard against dogmatism and a foundation of intellectual responsibility. Professor Bartov's work exemplifies this spirit. He shows us that the suppression of multiple voices and memories can lead to violence and authoritarianism, multiplicity of narratives, and engaging in rigorous debate are essential for democratic governance and for imagining just and viable futures. The debaters are here because I'm going to mention them. Yes, are they here? No? Okay, so not yet, but we will have the debates here after. In the same spirit of inquiry, controversy, and ethical responsibility, we welcome very much Professor Omer Bartov. If the commentators arrive, I will introduce them. So I give the floor to you. It's an enormous pleasure to have you. It's an honor and also a privilege to participate in what is going to be an intellectual banquet. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this extremely kind introduction. Thank you all for coming here. I feel a bit uncomfortable in the sense that there will be people who will respond to what I'm saying, but they're not here, so I don't know what they will respond to. But nonetheless, I'll try to speak about a topic that has been exercising me for a while. Some of you may know that over the past 2 years and a bit, I've engaged in a kind of debate that I have not engaged in before, and that had to do with the events that occurred on October 7th, 2023, and subsequently. I will refer to all this today, but the main topic that I'm talking about is related to the events of October 7th and the war and genocide in Gaza, but in a particular way. Later on, I'll be very happy to speak in more detail also about my writings and my thinking about the war and genocide in Gaza, what were the causes of that and where that might be heading, but that won't be the main theme of what I talk about right now. One thing that happened with, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, quite apart from the Israeli Defense Forces assault on Gaza, was that there were many protests around the world about the events that were occurring in Gaza. These protests were in large part in universities. They were unprecedented. Certainly the protests in the United States on campuses, including my own campus, were on a scale that had not been seen since Vietnam, since the protests against the Vietnam War. And that took many people, including university administrations, aback. It was surprising, and no one knew exactly what to do about it. Some of you may know that I was born and raised in Israel, and I spent the first half of my life there. I did my first degree there, my BA, until I moved to the United States in 1989. But I've had close contacts with Israel, have been there many times, have family there, and was in touch with Israeli academics for many years. And among other things, while I became increasingly critical of Israeli politics, I was not particularly supportive of aspects of the BDS movement, precisely because of the attempt to boycott Israeli universities, because my thinking was about Israeli policies, Israeli occupation and oppression of Palestinians. The universities were for October 7th. So I'll say just one word about what happened and what is happening on Israeli universities, and then I'll switch to American universities. Israeli universities, in the aftermath of October 7th, changed their attitude toward criticism dramatically and started, first of all, persecuting their own Palestinian students and faculty. There were statements and policies by Israeli university presidents, provosts, and deans that were completely out of line from anything that we had seen before. There was massive intimidation of Palestinian students. You may know or not that there are many Palestinian students in Israeli universities. And the reason for that is that, as some people don't know, 20% of the population of Israel, of the citizens of Israel, are Palestinian. And in recent years, Palestinians who are Israeli citizens have done their best to enter universities and enter the professions in Israel. And so some universities, especially the University of Haifa, which is in the north and takes in many students from the Galilee, where the bulk of Palestinians live, have large numbers of Palestinian students. Those Palestinian students, following the October 7th, the attack by Hamas, and then the Israeli assault on Gaza, expressed their opinions on social media and in other forums, and were immediately disciplined by the leadership of Israeli universities. And in June of 2024, so that's a few months after this happened, I visited Israel, and I was invited to give a talk at Beersheba University. But I could not hold that talk because there were a fair number of, and while they were not allowed to enter the lecture hall, they were allowed to use bullhorn and to hit on the... We wrote about this, so I'm not going to have a conversation with them. It was a very difficult conversation. Most of these students had served as reserve soldiers in Gaza. And so they had seen and often had participated in the mass killing that was happening in Gaza. And so the conversation with them was not easy. But I mentioned this event because the university authorities, the president and the provost, would do nothing to stop this and to allow my lecture to go on. And later on, argued that they had acted in protection of free speech. So what has been happening on Israeli universities, with some exceptions, of course, of professors who have been protesting what is going on, has been a intimidation of both students and faculty by the university authorities. But more importantly, those very same people that I had to Israeli universities, those people had presented themselves as liberal and open-minded, after October 7th, claimed to have, as the term went, sobered up, and to have understood that all their previous efforts, as they claimed they had made, to have peace with Palestinians were in vain, because all Palestinians wanted, that was their claim, was to kill us. So there was a sharp turn to the right within the faculty across Israeli universities, not only because of intimidation by the administration, but because those very academics, who otherwise were perfectly good academics and traveled around the world and were liberal-minded, adopted the position that there was nothing else to do but to either destroy Gaza or to ignore the fact that it was being obliterated. To the extent that personally, I should say, I decided to boycott Israeli universities, and I have friends who are academics there and whom I greatly admire, some who go and protest and go to protect Palestinians in the West Bank in particular, and are very brave in doing so. But the general outline of things is very different. To what extent that has echoes with what happened in universities in Europe, maybe in this country, I don't know enough about Brazil, but I know about Europe, in different periods, when universities went through what the Germans called a process of Gleichschaltung, of accommodation with the authorities. of towing the line. But I want to move from here to talk about where I work and teach, and that's in the United States. So as I said, just in the first few weeks after October 7th, there were growing protests by students on American campuses. And university administrations responded very harshly to these protests. In many cases, including at Brown, and of course at Columbia, and at Michigan, and at Dartmouth, and very notably at UCLA, and many other campuses, university presidents called in the police. And the police, if you know anything about the police in the United States, the NYPD or the LAPD, if you call them in, then they are not there to play nice. The police was called in, broke up what were called the encampments, where students were camping on the campus grounds, arrested students, and subsequently, many of these students were disciplined by the universities, by university administrations, suspended, punished, not allowed to come back to their classes, to the extent that by the end of the spring semester of 2024, the protests died down, and since then, there have been very little protests on campuses, because both students and faculty have been disciplined. And the question is, why were university administrations behaving in this way? These were all universities that proclaimed themselves to be liberal, open-minded, supportive of diversity, diversity of opinion. These were not conservative universities. They were in the forefront of liberalism in the United States. Why did they respond so harshly to these protests? The way I understand it is that what happened in the spring of 2024 tells us something about the structure of higher education in the United States, just as what we saw and see on Israeli campuses tells us something about Israeli societies. Those same institutions that claim to be islands of diversity and openness and pluralism depended on two major elements. One was donors. They depend on large amounts of money being donated by alumni and by other people who want to support them. And we are talking about large amounts of money. And they are dependent on a great deal of money coming in from the federal government, the US federal government. Now, many of these universities are private universities. Nonetheless, especially the research facilities depend on large amounts of money being given by the federal government. This, by the way, is a system that was created in the 1950s and worked very well. It was part of an alliance between American universities and what President Eisenhower at the time called the military-industrial complex. That is, that universities can produce knowledge and experts. The federal government will pay them to provide education and training, and in return, the federal government will get all those experts who will make it possible for the military-industrial complex to thrive. And that system worked very well for a long time, and everyone was happy. And professors like me, who obviously were beneficiaries of this system, knew about this, but everything seemed to be working fine until the spring of 2024. Now, if you try to think, why did the president of Harvard or the president of Columbia or the president of Brown or of UCLA call in the police to see why was it necessary to bring in the police, they were under pressure from the donors and from the federal government to do so. And if they wanted to keep their jobs, they had to act. And those who didn't lost their jobs. The president of Harvard was fired. The president of UPenn was fired. And they were fired because they were said not to have responded quickly and aggressively enough against these protests. So it turned out that the donors, who after all supported these universities and their claim to diversity and plurality and pluralism, were very sensitive to one issue. And that issue was protests against Israeli policies. And it turned out that the US government, and we are talking not about the Trump administration, remember, this is the Democratic administration under President Biden, that administration was very sensitive to any criticism of Israeli policies. And the line that was used in order to intimidate these universities, including to launch federal investigations of universities, was that these protests were anti-Semitic, and that shutting down these protests was in the name of protecting free speech. Just like what happened to me at the University of Beersheba when I was not allowed to talk in the name of free speech. Now, why were the universities so dependent on their donors? And why were they so dependent on the federal government? Because the business model that was created by universities, by these elite universities, was one which provides for excellent education by well-paid professors, accommodations in very luxurious dorms, high-tech classrooms, very high tuition. You may not know, but at universities like Brown, the tuition now is $100,000 per year, which is completely insane. In order to sustain that, the universities needed more and more money to come in and became more and more dependent on these donors. There is another element here, and that too is very important. And it depends on the university, but some reflect that more than others. And that is what I would call the corporate university. That is that universities have become also increasingly dependent on corporate money coming in to allow them to provide, to build all these labs, all these sophisticated science facilities in which they train their students. But of course, corporations don't do anything for free. There is no free lunch. They do it because they want the universities to promote that, and then they want the graduates of these universities to come and work for these corporations. That's the deal. The result of that has been, and that is a process that began long before the Hamas attack and long before the Israeli assault on Gaza, that there's been a growing erosion of the liberal arts in the very same universities that proclaim to be those that are liberal universities. That is that more and more resources were going toward the sciences, toward those fields of inquiry that can be put into practice, that are practical, that are useful. And those aspects of the university, which in many ways are where the university as an institution began in the Middle Ages, that is useless knowledge, where you don't study to do something, you study to think, you study to understand, you study to ask questions that no one can ask elsewhere. Those began to be increasingly underfunded by the universities. Because if you want to have a graduate program in engineering, no problem. Graduate students come with money to get training at your university. They bring money with them. If you want to have a graduate program in history, then you have to pay for these students. That costs the university money, so why have so many? And you then have to prove to the university that these students you trained then found some kind of good job, some kind of good position. And they don't always find them. They may then go to something else. But what you have given them is part of your contribution to society, to knowledge, to understanding. So this was another very important element that has been changing. And the last element, and I'm involved in that right now, I should say, because I'm on the faculty executive committee for Brown. We are now involved precisely in this issue. And while the university is guilty, the faculty is also part of the story. And that is the loss of faculty governance. To put it in a nutshell, I've been saying for a while, and I'm sure that many people here would agree with me, that the university is its faculty. Without the faculty, you can have beautiful buildings, you can have great doors, but without the faculty, there's no university. But if you put a number of faculty, of professors, of scholars, of people who know what they're talking about, in a room, without air conditioning, without beautiful dorms, without anything but a few young people, a few students, they can teach them. They create a university in that room. But the faculty over time, and it's not only in American universities, have lost the understanding of their own importance. And universities, because of all these other processes that I talked about, have become more centralized, more bureaucratized, and have taken over the governance of the university. And for a long time, for most faculty members, this is fine, because you don't want to sit on all kinds of committees and waste your time pushing papers. You want to either teach or do research or write books. And if there's some bureaucrat who does the rest of the work for you, that's fine, until you realize that they're actually deciding the fate of the university. And so the loss of faculty governance is very much part of what happened. And I'll give you just one example, because I know that particular case, how all this is connected. In May of 2024, there was an encampment on the green of Brown University. And the dean issued an instruction that students who were sitting there would be told by the university security that they would be disciplined for this. And that faculty who stopped by and visited the students in the encampment would also be issued a warning. And I found out that a number of faculty members of my own department had been issued this email, been sent an email by the dean warning them that if they ever did it again, they would be disciplined. One of them was also from Pakistan, and it was clear that the security there targeted him because of the way he looked. We called an emergency meeting, but the short of it was that the university that this could be done. But most of the faculty didn't pay attention because they had become used to it. Because there had been an assertion of authority over time by university administrators who at that point were under heavy pressure from their own donors and from the administration to discipline the students under allegations, completely false allegations of anti-Semitism on campus. So, okay, this is the sort of background that I wanted to share with you, and I just want to say a few things in closing, and then hopefully we can have a debate on this. Where do we go from here? I can't really speak about your system here because I'm unfamiliar with it, but I can say that in the United States there are a few things that need to happen and may not happen, but if they don't, then the university is changing in front of our eyes. The university will change in ways that will make it into a completely different entity from what it has been, or most universities, with some exceptions, and it will become a place to train people for the job market. And it will lose the role that it played for a very long time, for centuries, in advancing our other thinking, not our thinking in technology, engineering, but our thinking about what is the role of humans in society? Who are we? Why are we here? How can we think differently about what we do? In other words, literature, history, philosophy, anthropology, all those fields that are quite useless in terms of the immediate rewards, but that had greatly advanced our knowledge and have had also an important impact on how society functions and on our understanding of politics. But if we do act, what can we do? So I do think that, and I'm trying my very best in a very small place called Brown University to empower faculty, to remind faculty that they have to stand up, that they have to speak for, not just for themselves, not just for their careers, for their tenure, but for the university, to speak for what is academic freedom. And let me say just one thing about that. There's a great deal of confusion between freedom of expression and academic freedom. It's not the same thing. The United States has, because of its constitution, probably the most liberal interpretation of freedom of expression. I don't know of any country that has such protections of freedom of expression. But academic freedom is something else. Of course, academics have freedom of expression. They can write and say whatever they like. But in the classroom, that's different. They can't write and say whatever they like in the classroom. They can't say irresponsible things which are outside of their field of expertise just because they feel like it. They can do it on the street, but not in the classroom in their role as professors. So what is academic freedom? The most important thing, I think, about academic freedom is that academics determine what is correct and what is not correct among their own colleagues. Academics decide who should be promoted and who shouldn't. It's not a democratic system, by the way. It's the full professors decide for the associate professors who decide, but they use their knowledge, they use their experience to gauge and what is scholarship, what is better scholarship, what is outstanding scholarship. And no one should interfere in that, nor the state, nor the administration, nor the government. That is what academic freedom is about. And faculty have begun to lose their power in determining that and even in accepting that that is what they need to do. And so one very important thing is for faculty to regain faculty governance in the sense that they will determine who is hired, They may not be able to hire everybody they like because they don't have enough money for it. But if they have a choice, who to hire, who to fire, who to promote, who not to promote, who to tenure, who not to tenure. Another element which is not part of the system here, but is very much part of the system in the United States, is the universities, as I said before, have become extremely expensive. Now, everybody will tell you, when you speak with an administrator from Brown or Columbia or Harvard, they say, well, hardly anybody pays this tuition because the universities have a system of need-blind admission. That is, if you are admitted, then you can't pay the full tuition, then you negotiate with the university and you pay only part of that tuition, or not at all. But the tuition needs to be found. And because of that, the tuition is found through the donors. That's where the money comes from. It is crucial to find a way of changing the nature of these universities. And the way to do it may be, and here I'm actually hoping that we can talk about it, it may be that we need to rethink the way universities have functioned now for decades. That is to have those universities that train people for the job market, which are necessary. They often are called technical schools, and universities that train people in the humanities. Those are much cheaper. We academics, we historians or professors of literature cost much less than professors of law or professors of engineering. So it's possible that one could create a university system that would not need such high tuition, and would not need so many donors, and would not need so much money from the government, but would provide the kind of education that is now being eroded because of the overwhelming impact of the system as it is now. Maybe it's not possible to do, but I find it to be crucial if we want to determine that thinking and originality and nonconformity and creativity are the core of what the university should teach. And if you try to impose particular ways of speech, particular ways of thinking, particular ways of expression within the university itself, you're ruining the university as an institution, quite apart from the political implications this has outside of the university. And so let me finish just with, to go back to the case of Gaza. Because Gaza became a test case, and it exposed something that is in fact much larger than the horrors that occurred in Gaza. What it exposed, and the process that we're seeing, and we're seeing it right now in the United States, is an attempt to silence speech. It's an attempt to create, to have a chilling effect. When the administration and its various cronies, including all kind of university administrators, say that they're fighting anti-Semitism, they know that they're not. They know that they're instrumentalizing, or as they say in the United States, weaponizing anti-Semitism to control speech. And once that we see that as something odious, say anti-Semitic, because we don't agree with you, once you do that, you can expand that to any speech. It does not have at all to be about criticism of Israel. It can be about any criticism of the administration, of the government, of the Supreme Court, of anything that you see happening in society. If you can use this instrument to control speech. And in fact, of course, the great irony, and we see that now finally showing its ugly face, is that those people who were attacking universities and university presidents for allowing anti-Semitism on their campuses are themselves revealing their own anti-Semitic inclinations. They were never interested in that. They realized that it was something that they could use, and they will use it against those very communities, those very minorities, those very groups that universities had at least claimed to be supporting. They will use it against them. And that's something that we have to keep in mind, because the kind of doublespeak that we've been watching over the last 2 years has not ended. And there's not been enough resistance from universities, from the intelligentsia in general, against that, and not enough effort to try and expose it. So I'll stop here, and I hope we can have a good discussion. Thank you.
So I want to open the floor for the audience, and then I have also some questions, but I think that you should start, please.
Boa noite, obrigado. Eu faço a pergunta em português ou em inglês?
Sim, português. Pode ser.
Eu gostaria de perguntar ao professor se o povo palestino em Gaza tinha democracia com o governo do Hamas.
Samuel, and yes.
Sim. Ah, tá. Deixa eu passar. Instigating talk. I'd like to ask to you specifically, as a world acknowledged scholar of Holocaust and of genocides. I work here in music. I introduced myself to you as a professor of music here, and I study music in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, where genocide is perpetrated by the Brazilian state very often, right? Quite recently, we had some tragic events here in Rio de Janeiro, more than 100 people being killed in just one action, police action, in one specific place. I'd like to ask you, how could the Israeli people support a government which is perpetrating genocide? I would like you to explore a little bit more what can possibly explain the support of the Israeli people to the Israeli government right now, perpetrating this genocide, this Holocaust, sacrifice by fire, as the Greek etymology points to us. So this is my question.
Boa noite, professor. Boa noite a todos presentes. Vou fazer minha pergunta em português, porque eu não me sinto confortável de fazer em inglês, então, o senhor me perdoe. O senhor, na sua fala, o senhor falou sobre uma guinada à direita, principalmente pós o 7 de outubro de 2023, dentro das universidades israelenses, sendo que lá para 2022, 2023, nós já estávamos vendo, pelo menos na política israelense, essa virada acontecendo. Mesmo com os protestos e tudo mais, havia essa virada à direita acontecendo. Eu queria que o senhor me falasse um pouco mais a respeito de como essa virada ela entrou dentro das universidades, dentro da academia, se isso também, se o 7 de outubro ele foi só um estopim para uma virada que já iria acontecer de alguma forma, ou se ela foi realmente, se o 7 de outubro em si foi só o único motivo para essa virada acontecer. E uma segunda questão, o senhor falou sobre a questão nos Estados Unidos, das universidades, das doações, né, dessa caça, vamos dizer assim, né, dessa caçada a pessoas que são divergentes, com opiniões divergentes ou discordantes. Eu queria que o senhor falasse um pouco mais do que está acontecendo, se o senhor tem algum conhecimento nisso nas universidades israelenses, se tem essa questão com se essa questão de doações, de verbas para as universidades, tem a ver com, de alguma forma, atrapalha, enfim, acaba por, não sei, ajudar a essa perseguição de alunos palestinos, enfim, não sei se eu fui muito certa na questão, mas são essas duas questões que eu tenho em mente no momento. Obrigada.
Thank you. Thank you for these questions. About democracy in Gaza, Hamas is not a democratic organization. It's a very violent organization. It's an organization that is violent, especially against women. It does not believe in democracy. It's not part of its ideology. It came to power in elections. It was elected into power in the mid-2000s. And that was the last election that occurred in Gaza. So Palestinians in Gaza did not enjoy democracy. They also don't enjoy democracy in the West Bank. The West Bank is ruled, at least hypothetically, by the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority also has not had elections now for many, many years. So there is no democracy. It would be nice to have democracy for Palestinians, but they don't have it. The only Palestinians in between the river and the sea who have a semblance of democracy are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And they actually vote. Now, there are major attempts, there have been in the past, and they're increasing now, by the Israeli government under Netanyahu to limit their ability to vote and to outlaw some parties as non-Zionist parties. And of course, Arab parties in Israel are not Zionist. There's no reason why Palestinians would be Zionists. It's not, that's a Jewish ideology, not a Palestinian ideology. But the truth of the matter is that it's not only a policy of the right in Israel. The Israeli opposition can only accomplish power in Israel, topple the current right-wing coalition if it goes in coalition with the Arab parties. Because as I said, Israeli Palestinian citizens of Israel are 20% of the population. But the opposition parties don't want to say that. They're afraid of going with the Palestinians. First, because some of them just don't want to, some of these leaders. And secondly, because they're afraid that they would lose their own voters. And so in that sense, Palestinians who have the right to vote have often felt that they don't play any role in Israeli politics. And often the vote, the rate of voting is very low because they feel that they have no impact. That no one is interested in their vote. So that's in terms of democracy for Palestinians. There isn't any. In terms of how could Israel or how could the Israeli public support genocide? Look, I mean, this is what kept me up at night since October 7th. You know, many people in Israel, or at least some people in Israel, thought before October 7th that there could be a point at which some event say a massacre, some big terrorist action, would trigger Israeli politicians and military to attempt ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And this has been spoken about in various circles now for years. But the assumption was that sooner or later, this would be stopped by the international community, that the United States, Britain, France, Germany would not allow Israel to continue something like that for more than a few days or a couple of weeks. So first of all, what happened was that Israel was given total impunity to continue. No one believed it. Even Israeli politicians, far-right politicians, were shocked that they could just keep going. Now that, as such, already empowers also people in Israel. If the Germans say it's okay, the Americans say it's okay, maybe it's okay. But there's much more to it than that. The Israeli public over decades, since '67, and increasingly after the Second Intifada, after 2000, has become immune to Palestinian suffering. Palestinians have become dehumanized in the eyes of most Israelis. And I'm not talking about the right wing. I'm talking about the majority of Israelis who simply weren't thinking about those people living on the other side of the defense barrier of this wall that was built after the Second Intifada. We're not thinking about what's going on in Gaza under blockade for 16 years. It was not an issue in Israeli elections. It was also not an international issue. Do you remember any big debates about Palestinians in the years before October 7th? No. This is one reason for the Hamas attack, but that's another issue. So there was a kind of indifference to the fate of Palestinians. And people bought into Netanyahu's idea that we could manage the occupation. We don't need to solve the issue. We can manage it. They're on the other side of this wall or of this fence or whatever. And when do Israelis actually meet them? When they put on a uniform and cross over and wake them up at 4 in the morning, kick down their door, beat them up, humiliate them, to show them that they are the strong, to explain to them who is boss. Then came October 7th. And October 7th was such a shock to Israeli society, not only because 800 civilians were killed, and that's shocking enough. And this was massacre. And there were people who were trying to deny it. And no, it was a massacre. It was a war crime. It was a crime against humanity. There were rapes there. There were children killed. There were 250 people taken hostage, including old people and children and pregnant women. This was brutal. And so the first thing was the Israeli public was appalled and shocked and angry and wanted revenge. But the second was that nobody believed that the Palestinians could do that. How could they do it? Israel had built a multi-billion-dollar fence. Nobody could cross that fence. And now these guys who have no tanks, have no airplanes, have no artillery, have a few Toyota Jeeps and AK-47s and RPG rocket launchers, attack the Israeli army and kill also 400 Israeli soldiers. It was not only civilians that were killed there. So the rage that those people were being dehumanized, who we thought were, we can manage them, suddenly took over, was such that the response was, I have to say, typical to other colonial powers when they faced an uprising by the colonized. They went out to exterminate them. Exterminate all the brutes, if you remember that line from The Heart of Darkness. This was the response. This was the response in German Southwest Africa in 1904 when the Herero rose up, and this was the response by the IDF. Over the long run, what we see, because I would say that was in the early months, But what kept shocking me was also the extraordinary, not just indifference, but denial of what was actually happening. One reason that I decided that I can't go to Israel is that I meet people who I know are liberal, open-minded, they've traveled around the world, they've read many books, love music, art, and they don't want to talk about it. They see me and they know that I've written something about it and they want to change the subject. I feel the discomfort. They deny that it happened. They say there was no choice. And they say they had it coming, all at the same time. That's a mechanism of denial of the kind that facilitates, allows for not knowing and allowing and justifying all at the same time. I wrote an essay about this a few weeks ago, and I started thinking about the phenomenon of Holocaust denial, of Holocaust revisionism, of negationism, as the French call it. That you say, well, it wasn't really 6 million. Maybe it was just 1 million. And there couldn't be gas chambers. There's no evidence from inside the gas chambers. I mean, no one survived. How do we know that it happened? This kind of logic that, of course, infuriated survivors, infuriated people who knew exactly what happened. And to see that mechanism come into play in Israel was shocking to me. But part of it is the Holocaust. And that's what's so hard to face. Part of it is the Holocaust. Because in Israel over time, this is not something, again, that of course didn't begin on October 7th. The Holocaust became something different from what it was when I was growing up in Israel. At the time, we were ashamed of it. People went like sheep to the slaughter. There were few brave souls that fought in the Warsaw Ghetto, and we learned that a lot because they were a model for us. We also will die holding a gun. But the rest, like all our families, went like sheep to the slaughter. But over time, that changed. And the logic became a different logic. The logic became that the Holocaust is something that all Jews around the world, whether they were European or Mizrahi, whether they were alive then or born later, were all potential targets of the Holocaust. Not only the Holocaust that happened, but the Holocaust that may happen again. The never again in Israel was not about never again genocide, never again inhumanity. It was never again that thing to us. It was a never again that said we should always be ready. And if anybody ever raises their head, if Palestinians throw a rock at us because we're occupying them, if we don't put them down, we may end up in Auschwitz. So that on October 7th, immediately, people said, oh, this is the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. The Holocaust came to the fore right away. And then they said, Hamas, they're Nazis. They're worse than the Nazis. There were politicians who said on the media, they are worse than the Nazis. But I don't know how you can be worse than the Nazis, but they were. So if they're Nazis, what do you do with Nazis? You have to eradicate them. And if there are people, and many people in Israel, including the president of the state and many generals and politicians, said there are no uninvolved people in Gaza. Everyone is involved. If everyone is involved and they're all Nazis, then their children are also potentially Nazis. All they need is to grow up. That's genocidal logic, and that's genocidal logic that is built and legitimized with the memory of genocide. And so if you want to understand the kind of combination of denial and support and indifference to the fate of Palestinians, that's at the core of it. There was a professor who was my professor at Tel Aviv University, Yehuda Elkanah, who wrote about that in 1987 during the first Intifada. He said that education, that pumping in the Holocaust to all young generations of Israelis, that they are constantly warding off a Holocaust rather than enforcing an occupation, that will dehumanize Israelis. And that's what it did over time. So there was one other question, I think. Yes, on donations. Look, I mean, this is, so there's American universities and Israeli universities. People feel uncomfortable speaking about donations to American universities because not a few of these donors, these very rich multi-billionaires, are Jewish. And they have claimed to be speaking in the name of the Jewish community in America. That they will withdraw their donations from Brown, and one of them did, or from Harvard, or from Columbia, because they want to protect Jews from anti-Semitism, and these universities have become a den of anti-Semitism. They don't represent the Jewish community, and they're drunk on their own power. But it is true that quite a number of these donors are Jewish, they're very rich, and they're using their power to try and control speech on universities. And what they're doing, I'm afraid, is only stoking anti-Semitism. Because of course that the argument that will come in response to that was that these Jews have power and they are shutting down free speech in America. And that they claim to represent the Jewish community, just like Israel claims to represent all the Jews around the world, so that if you are a Jew walking down the street, people will come up to you and say, why are you killing people in Gaza? Now, there are also, of course, other sources of so-called Jewish power in the United States, the Jewish lobby, that have had an impact on American policy. It is clear that many American representatives, many people elected to Congress and to the Senate, supported by funds from the Jewish lobby. One good result, I would say, of the protests against what happened in Gaza is that these monies are beginning to have a bad smell. And that there are more and more American politicians who are saying to their own constituents, which is why democracy is still a good thing, because they hear from their constituents that they're mad at them, they're saying, we are not taking this money. And again, these lobbies don't represent the Jewish community in America. Many of my own students on my campus at Brown who were protesting and who were arrested, the first students who were arrested at Brown were all Jewish students. They were protesting against what was happening in their name. So that too is part of, I think, an unraveling and an exposure of a system that was put into place where the State of Israel succeeded in creating for itself a great deal of power within American politics, American universities, American industry, American technology. They're very closely interlinked. And it's not ideology. It's often an issue of money, of technology, of interest, of profit. The case of Israeli universities is quite different. Yes, of course, they also receive money, a lot of money. Huge amounts of research money comes to Israeli universities from the European Union, not from the United States. And the European Union has its own issues deciding on a policy, Henry Kissinger once said, I want to talk with the foreign minister of the European Union. So there is no foreign minister of the European Union. So the problem is that it's very hard for the EU to agree on a policy. There have been many voices in Europe saying that these funds, which go to research, much of that research is research related to creation of weaponry, of sophisticated military technology, that these funds should stop flowing from the European Union to Israel. But again, if you want to be realistic and think how that works, Germany, for instance, or Denmark, let's say, imposed limits on selling arms to Israel and then bought military technology from Israel. Germany bought a whole missile system from Israel, system produced by funds provided by the European Union and technology from the United States. And so if you want to understand how, and I should add that universities like the University of Tel Aviv, my alma mater, are heavily engaged in production of knowledge for military technologies. And people who serve in Israeli military units such as 8200, the vast intelligence branch, come out of that and go directly into jobs in technology corporations, Israeli and American, which are often overlapping. So in order to stop that, you have to actually expose this kind of one hand washing the other. And that's something that academics, researchers, are particularly good at doing if they set their minds to it, if they actually understand that in order to stop this kind of marketplace of death, which I should say includes also the war between Russia and Ukraine, you should understand that producers of arms have been having a fantastic time since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then the Israeli invasion of Gaza. They've been selling technology, arms, at a higher rate than ever before. They've been making huge amounts of money. People have to know that, and they have to work against them, and that's in their own countries. That's not only protesting what Israel is doing, which of course one should, but that's to get at the root of the issue. Why countries like Denmark and Germany and Britain and France and Italy and even Spain, on the one hand say that they're appalled by what is happening there, and on the other hand keep working on that military technology and feeding money and know-how and arms into that very system. So yeah, thanks. And Arthur Miller wrote a famous play on all this years and years ago called They Were All My Sons, and people don't watch it anymore.
Well, I also would like to ask some questions. First of all, I would like to say that I totally agree with your analysis on the faculty, on the universities, that they really changed it very much. They lost its purposes and also fundamentals. So I really agree with this. But I have two questions that are broad questions, and I'm sorry for that, but they are really part of my nightmare. So I really want to have your answer, mainly because you're a field of your academic field, history. The first one is, what would you say from this perspective that are the roots of violence, the roots of fanaticism and protest? And the second one is, what could be the line between anti-Semitism and the support, the real support for Palestinians, and what history has to say about it. Because I think that these are really questions that occupy my mind, and I can't sleep because of them. Thanks. There is another question, please.
I, of course, apologize for my lateness since I was in the episode in the Institute of History, celebration of 15th birth anniversary. But I just asked, my two questions have exactly to do with yours, and that's why I asked for this thing. One, you wrote a wonderful piece in The Guardian and later in the New York Times. I have studied genocide, and that's how it looks like. And it had also a very furious response to that. So my first question is, what's the role of historians in this thing? And how have you seen, since you have published that particular article, how has been the response of historians in this particular case? The second is also connected to your question. We have seen the idea of anti-Semitism, or the fight against anti-Semitism, being appropriated by the right in a way to control, as a tool to control universities. We have seen it happen in the United States, have seen it happening in Germany, and we are now seeing it happen in Italy. And you saw Carlo Ginzburg and Giovanni Levi against the Del Rio decree, which would make any kind of criticism of the Israeli government equivalent to anti-Semitism. So how much it's the idea of the right to control, because we have our own experiences of attempts of the right to control our universities in Brazil, and how much it's the same language and vocabulary that have been used in these two-pronged actions of the right, of the international right. Thank you.
Let me just say that Professor Lisa Cedres is here, and she served as the coordinator of the graduate program in social history at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro since 2011, and also she has a doctorate in history from Stanford University, and your fields of history are so many. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. These are all very easy questions to answer. So look, I mean, when you talk about the roots of violence, it depends where you want to begin, right? Because you could argue that violence has been inherent to human civilization from in fact, before civilization, to human societies from the very beginning. And that's not my field, and I'm not going to talk about that. I did spend my early career also as a military historian, and definitely war has been part of human society since the beginning of history. In fact, the early history books ever written were written about wars. So history and war are closely connected. But if you talk about the role of violence, fanatics, and you said violence, fanatics, and protest, was it? Yes. So that's somewhat different. I would talk about it this way. I mean, I try to explain to some extent how I understand the Israeli side. That is that at the root of the license for violence on the Israeli side are probably two main issues. As I said before, one is the Holocaust. It has served as a license for violence, and it has served as a license to go against all the rules and conventions of warfare, the entire system of international law, by saying after the Holocaust, when the nations of the world stood by and we were slaughtered, nobody has a right to tell us what to do. If we feel that we are threatened, we will respond with all we have. The second root of Israeli violence is the very occupation itself. It's the fact that if you brutalize people, if you dehumanize people over decades, it brutalizes and dehumanizes you. And Israeli society has become more violent. It's violent against Palestinians. It's also violent against its own people. It's become an increasingly violent society. When I was a teenager, we used to demonstrate holding posters saying, "Occupation corrupts." And we had no idea how right we were. The occupation corrupted Israeli society. And violence is a deep element in that. It's corrupted the legal system, because if you have an apartheid system, obviously the whole legal system is corrupted, including the Supreme Court that was being defended by Israeli protesters before October 7th. But if you talk about violence from the Palestinian side, and there's been a lot of violence from the Palestinian side, although of course Palestinians are much weaker and much less well armed. Violence from the Palestinian side, in large part, is a product of Israeli oppression. If you oppress people, if you humiliate them, if you give them no choice, they are likely to respond. They've always remember this line from Frederick Douglass. If you read his memoir of being a slave, when he was whipped by his owner, and he stood up and he fought back, and he says, "This is when I became a man." Resistance to oppression is natural. It's what humans do. If you talk about one side of humanity that is violent, that is prone to go to war of one kind or another, another is a desire for liberty, for freedom, to not be under someone else's boot. And when you're ruled in a brutal way, and when you're treated like an animal, you will respond brutally. This is not to say that I condone the crimes carried out by Hamas. I do not. And I would be very happy if Israel had not killed all these leaders. I would have liked to see them in a court of law, just as much as I'd like to see Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu and a fair number of other people in The Hague, because they'll never be in court in Israel. But resistance is natural. And of course, I grew up, I was raised in Israel on the ethos of resistance, even though it was clear that it was hopeless, because that is what gives you dignity as a human being. If you're about to die, don't die like a dog. So, in that sense, it's a situation that creates violence. And the way to stop the violence is to change the situation, to transform the entire paradigm. What is so tragic about this particular situation is that because there are leaders in Israel and Palestinian leaders, the leaders of Hamas, and people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are very, very similar. They're fanatics, they're messianic in some way, they don't believe in any reason. And they thrive on despair and hopelessness. They thrive on people believing that there is no other choice. Just like people in Israel said, well, we have no choice. We have to do it. We don't like killing children, but we have no choice. Hamas is everywhere there. Many people will say that to you, people who are perfectly reasonable, will say, well, look, I mean, Hamas is under all these tunnels. We had no choice. 20,000 children, we had no choice. That's the logic that these people thrive on. Okay,
What would be the choice?
Okay, that's a whole other question. So you have to provide an alternative.
Yes.
There is an alternative. I've been working with a group now for several years, and we're trying now to also disseminate knowledge about it in the United States, where it really matters that people know about it. It's a group called A Land for All. You can Google it, A Land for All. It was established and is still run by an equal number of Palestinians and Israeli Jews. And it's an attempt to square the circle that was created through the Israeli occupation. That is, that the two-state solution, the old idea of the two-state solution is defunct. You cannot have the two-state solution because you can't separate these two groups. They're stuck with each other. You have 700,000 Palestinians, Jews living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. You cannot simply uproot them. You can't do it. It'll be civil war. They are heavily represented in the Israeli army, in the security forces, in the government. You can't take them out. And within the Green Line, Jews and Palestinians lived side by side. And the infrastructure of this whole country, from the Jordan to the sea, is inextricably connected. The roads, the energy, water, everything. So, and yet, each group wants rightly to have a right of determination and a right of return. That's the two most important elements for both Palestinians and Jews. And we are not in a position to tell them whether they have a right to that or not. They have a right to demand that. So the question is, how do you do that? And this Land for All is an attempt to do that by creating a confederation that would have two sovereign states, Palestine and Israel, more or less along the 1967 borders. But the distinction between that and the defunct two-state solution would be that there would be a difference or a distinction between citizenship and residence. So that you could be a citizen of one state, say of Palestine, but you could reside in the other state, say in Israel. And you would vote for the Palestinian parliament. You may be able to vote in local elections for the place that you reside in, but in national elections you would vote for the country of your citizenship. Now, what does that mean? It would mean that the borders would be open and people could move from one place to another. It would not be these two states that would have minefields and barbed wire and patrols between one and the other. The borders would be open. There would be common institutions, common bodies in Jerusalem that would be the capital of both states that would negotiate the terms between those two entities and the external borders. Now, obviously, the numbers would have to be controlled and would have to be agreed on. Just like in the EU, you can be a German and decide to live in Paris. And you would have a permit of residence in Paris. It's not difficult. But if 300,000, 900,000, 2 million Germans suddenly decided to move to Paris, that would be a problem. So you'd have to negotiate that. But the idea would be that you could be a Palestinian living in in Rio, tracing your family back to Haifa, and if you chose to, you could go to Palestine and become a Palestinian citizen. And then you could apply for residence in Haifa, and you could live there. You would get permission to live there. Now, people will ask, so what happens with those 700,000 settlers? Well, the assumption would be that large numbers of them would not want to remain in the state of Palestine. Most of the people living, most of the Jews living in the West Bank came there because they were getting cheap housing. They didn't come there for ideological reasons. They were told it's 20 minutes down the road to your workplace, and you get a nice villa with a beautiful view of olive trees that then some of the settlers go and uproot. So the assumption is that many of them would leave. Those who remain behind would have to agree that they live under Palestinian law, and that if they break the law by, say, going and uprooting olive trees of the village next to them, they would be deported, and they would not be allowed back. So that's not a process that would be from one day to the next, and there's certainly not enough support for that, either among Palestinians or among Israeli Jews right now, but it is a horizon which I believe is necessary to have exactly in order to break this sort of grim logic of violence that the extremists on both sides have created. And that's what we're trying to talk about these days and to propagate. I want to answer a couple of other questions, if I may, very quickly. The line between anti-Semitism and support for Palestine, look, I mean, support for Palestine is not anti-Semitic, and even an opposition to Zionism is not anti-Semitic, and even being anti-Zionist is not anti-Semitic. Zionism is a political ideology. You can like it or not. You can support it or not. It's not an identity. It's an ideology. You can decide that it's your identity, but it's an ideology. There were many Jews, and there still are today, including members of the Israeli government, who are non-Zionist. The Orthodox members of the Israeli government are non-Zionist. They do what they would have done had they been living in Poland in the 1930s. They want the government to fund their religious schools. That's their goal of being in the government. And now, of course, not to forbid the government from recruiting the young men into the military. But they're against the state. Theologically, they're against the state. They think that the state of Israel is anathema. The state of Israel would come only at the end of days. So this is, what is the term? This is acting before the Messiah has arrived. But we can and we should distinguish between what is anti-Semitism and what is not, right? Anti-Semitism, if someone, I'll give you an example, a very simple example. If I walk down the street and I'm wearing a yarmulke or a Star of David, and somebody comes up to me and hits me over the head and says, "Why are you killing people in Gaza?" That's an anti-Semitic act. Because this person assumed that because I'm Jewish, I have a particular ideology, I'm a Zionist, I support Israel. On the other hand, if this person sees me going down the road and says, "Hey, what do you think about what's happening in Gaza?" And we have a conversation, and we disagree, and he says, "And I support it," and he's against it. That's not anti-Semitic. This person talks with me about my opinions, and I can have one opinion or one ideology or one position or another, and they can agree with me or not agree with me. So anti-Semitism is a prejudice. And anti-Zionism is a political position against another political position. And to confuse the two is something that has happened over time, supported very much by the Israeli government, particularly under Netanyahu, over time, pushing a particular definition of anti-Semitism, the infamous IHRA definition, which has 11 examples of speech, of which 7 are about Israel. And anti-Semitism should not be about Israel. It should be about Jews. There are Jews in Israel. You can be anti-Semitic against the Israeli state, but it has to be about Jews, not about ideology. And that has been pushed very strongly by the state of Israel. Now, quickly on the roles of historians. Look, I mean, you know, of course, historians have played all kinds of roles in history. Some good, some not so good. Historians in the 19th century were the main promoters and myth makers of nationalism, along with novelists, right? And nationalism, certainly ethno-nationalism, at least in my view, is one of the worst things that happened in human history. It's created a huge amount of bloodshed and hatred and oppression. And historians played a big role in that. But historians are, you know, Leclerc. They are, and they can betray their profession or not. And I believe that as historians, we have a role to play in trying, first of all, to think for ourselves on the basis of what we know of the past as to what reality is now and where it is going, and to try as carefully and reasonably and dispassionately analyze what we see now on the basis of what we know had happened in the past, and to warn against what we think may happen. That was something that I tried to do. That is what I tried to do. It's true that historians often feel uncomfortable talking about the present and the future. We're much better forecasting the past than the future. But I think it is a role that, and I do believe that historians, and not only historians, have abstained from doing that. In part, in this case, because people say it's so sensitive and people worry that it may besmirch their reputation. Many people, if they're German or French or British or American, are afraid that they would be told that saying anything critical is anti-Semitic. And they don't want to be called that. They know they're not, but they're afraid of being called that. But in part, I think it's simply a sort of something that has happened to academics, which I was talking about before, that they have lost, and historians among them, that they've lost the notion that they actually play a social role. They're not just people who teach at the university, who give grades, who get tenure. They actually have a social political role to play. And they don't need to play it all the time, but at times of crisis, at times of urgency, they should step up and use their own authority in the field that they know something about to talk about it. And my own experience has been, I have to say, a good one. I got a lot of hate mail, yes, but the experience was a good one. The experience was that people told me that because I publicly tried to think through what I saw was happening and tried to explain it to others, it helped them understand things. And it helped them reach a particular conclusion, whether they agreed with me or not. And that actually gave me hope that maybe more people, and there haven't been enough, could actually play that role, and in that way justify what I was talking about at the beginning, that We can't have universities only training people how to create rockets and build bridges. We need people who can actually speak to society as historians, as sociologists, as philosophers, as professors of literature, who can speak from their own fount of knowledge and wisdom to society about its own current predicament in a way that others can't. And if we cut that down, then there won't be voices that would do that. Then we'll only have the technocrats, and however well trained they are, they will not see what we can see. So yes, so I think it is an important role. And I think people, one last thing I'll say that I think is important for me to say, I wrote about my conclusion that Israel was carrying out genocide in Gaza in August of 2024 in The Guardian. And at the time, opinions were very split. Between then and the time that I published the piece in July of 2025, the New York Times, generally a consensus was created among scholars of genocide and experts in international law. It took time. It's not bad that it took time. People needed to make sure that they don't use this term in vain. And it was used too early by people who jumped the gun, I think. But a consensus was created. Has it had an impact? Not yet. I have to say, public opinion, yes, public opinion has shifted, but in political elites, no. And one can only hope that the pressure will continue. But there has been a change, and I'm happy to say that I was not the first, not among the first, but that what I wrote also played a role in that.
Thank you, Professor Bartov. But I think I'm going to switch to Portuguese, if you don't mind. Okay, I feel more comfortable. Bom, eu queria primeiro falar sobre democracia. O senhor falou sobre democracia, falou que na Palestina, em Gaza, não tem democracia, que na Cisjordânia não tem democracia, e deu a entender que em Israel tem democracia. Você falou, todo mundo pode votar em Israel, inclusive os palestinos. Bom, meu entendimento sobre a democracia não se resume apenas na possibilidade do cidadão votar ou não. Eu que vivi 21 anos na ditadura, sou velho o suficiente para ter vivido 21 anos na ditadura, votei em vereadores, governadores, senadores, né? Não votei para presidente, mas votei regularmente e vivi numa ditadura. Também acho que, se a gente perguntar para os imigrantes americanos lá nos Estados Unidos, hoje, se eles vivem numa democracia, eu acho que eles vão responder que não. Então, a ideia da democracia, eu acho que é uma ideia mais ampla do que a ideia apenas da possibilidade de se votar, de se escolher os seus representantes, né? Eu estou falando em democracia porque eu quero questionar a democracia em Israel, eu quero questionar justamente a ideologia do sionismo, porque na ideia do sionismo, na ideia básica do sionismo, está a ideia de que nós estamos construindo um Estado para os judeus, né? Se eu, que sou judeu, quiser ir hoje para Israel, eu terei regalias, direitos, mais direitos do que um palestino que pode votar, mas que está em Israel, que eventualmente não pode servir o exército. E eu, se for para Israel hoje, vou ter uma série de ajudas simplesmente pelo fato de ser judeu. Então, eu acho que isso coloca um problema de base na democracia em Israel. E eu gostaria de ouvir a sua opinião a respeito justamente da ideologia sionista, que é um Estado de judeus para os judeus. né? Se é um Estado para os judeus, evidentemente não é um Estado para todo mundo igual. Para quem não é judeu, é diferente para quem é judeu, e, de fato, Israel, para quem não é judeu, é diferente do que é judeu. Então, para onde é que a gente vai avançar? Essa concepção e essa ideologia nos levou até aqui onde nós estamos, que é uma situação terrível, né? Claro que a gente pode falar hoje que um Estado binacional é uma enorme dificuldade, mas também a gente pode falar que qualquer coisa é uma enorme dificuldade. Então, a gente pode citar o Galeano, o Eduardo Galeano, de dizer que a utopia é para onde a gente deve caminhar, embora o Eduardo Galeano sempre tenha dito que ele jamais falou essa frase, que essa frase não é dele, mas isso é uma outra história, né? Mas, de qualquer maneira, eu gostaria que a gente discutisse realmente para onde é que a gente pode caminhar, porque, de fato, nós estamos numa encruzilhada tremenda, né? Eu estou falando muito, e essa é a minha primeira observação, mas eu queria fazer uma segunda observação, porque se fala muito, se discute muito a respeito da direita em Israel, mas se fala muito pouco a respeito da esquerda em Israel, né? Israel foi governado, eu não sei se a maior parte, eu não sou historiador, eu não sei se a maior parte do tempo, mas boa parte do tempo, pela chamada esquerda, vamos chamar assim, tem uma dificuldade com esses nomes, esquerda e direita, mas vamos falar assim. Mas Partido Trabalhista, MAPAI, MAPAN, né? Então, boa parte do tempo, Israel foi governado pela esquerda. E estamos aonde estamos. Eu gostaria de ouvir do senhor quais são as críticas, quais foram os erros, eventualmente quais foram os acertos, quais foram os erros do pensamento de esquerda na comunidade judaica. Obrigado. Meu nome é Flávio Dixten. Pelo sobrenome você pode ver que eu sou judeu.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much for this question. You gave me an opportunity to raise a number of issues that I did not raise today. The first thing I want to say is that I have a book coming out which is called Israel, What Went Wrong? And in that book, the longest chapter in that book is called The Missing Constitution. And that chapter talks in a fair amount of detail about much of what you were raising. It talks about why, or let me put it that way, Israel issued on May 14th, 1948, a declaration of a state, which is known in Israel as the Declaration of Independence, but that's not the official name of it. And the text of that declaration went through many, many drafts. It drew, among other things, on the American Declaration of Independence. But parts of it were governed by the UN November 29th, 1947 partition resolution, which called for the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state, and demanded that those states be democratic and ensure a Bill of Rights. And so in order for Israel to be accepted into the UN, it had to issue a statement that included these elements. That is, that all, as that statement says, that all citizens of the state, no matter the gender, the religion, the ethnicity, or their race, would have equal rights. And it also announced that it would be endorsing a constitution by October of that year. But it didn't do that. And it still has not done it. The constitution was supposed to be in the spirit of that declaration, which again was governed by demands of the UN. Now, in the book I talk about the fact that this is what converted Zionism from being an ideology of a movement that brought Jews from Eastern Europe to Palestine into a state ideology, because there was no constitution. And Zionism, the goal of Zionism was to create a Jewish majority state. It was an ethno-national ideology, which made for the issue that you raise. That is, can Israel be a Jewish and democratic state simultaneously? In the Declaration of Independence, curiously, neither term is used. It's called a Jewish state, but it's not called a democratic state. But by 1992, years later, the most important justice of the Supreme Court in Israel, Aaron Barak, guided the Supreme Court and Parliament into enacting two basic laws, which were supposed to be the beginning of the creation of a constitution that would resolve this issue. That is, how do you have a Jewish and democratic state? Whether he would have succeeded or not even then is questionable, but what you actually see from the early 1990s in Israel until today is a struggle between those who believe that somehow that is possible and those who want to overturn all these promises that had been made but never kept for a society, a country of all its citizens, which was, of course, a slogan that became very popular during the Oslo Accords, that Israel would become a country, a state of all its citizens, meaning Jews and Arabs. So, is it possible? Was it possible? Well, it turned out it wasn't. And what we saw between February of 2023 and October of 2023 was a moment at which the Israeli government, it's this same government that is still today, tried to carry out what it called a judicial overhaul, meaning it wanted to greatly weaken the Supreme Court, to increase the powers of the executive, and to do that in order to create a different kind of political system in Israel. This caused mass demonstrations in Israel. There were hundreds of thousands of people on the street every weekend. And it continued until October 7th. Now, what were these people protesting about? In August 4th of 2023, a number of colleagues and myself issued a declaration called The Elephant in the Room, which was signed at the time by about 2,500 people, mostly professors of history and Jewish history and Middle East history and sociology, and quite a number of rabbis, mostly retired rabbis, because otherwise they would have been fired. What we said was that these protests were great. They want to preserve their rights, but whose rights? That they're fighting for the rights of Jewish Israelis. What they're refusing to recognize is the elephant in the room, which is the occupation. And that without resolving that issue, the country cannot be a democracy. Now, that ended, of course, with October 7th. The judicial overhaul is ongoing. It's not an overhaul, it's a coup. It's ongoing. There are laws in the making right now. And the future of that country is to become exactly the kind of country that you describe. A country that will have elections, just like Hungary has elections, Russia has elections, Turkey has elections, but they don't have democracy. That's the kind of country that is in the making now, by limiting the powers of the judiciary and by censoring all true opposition parties. how do we change that? A binational state is a great idea. It's a very old idea. It existed already in the 1920s and became quite prominent in the 1930s, not among a majority. And it went out the window in 1948, during the war and after the war. Right now, it is likely that most Israeli citizens and most Palestinians don't want a binational state. If they did, I think it would be a very good solution, or just it's a state of all its citizens, meaning that all occupied Palestinians would become citizens. The plan that I talked about has that as a potential. If you have a confederation of two states, and if they share the space, and if people can move from one to another, they can decide at one point that they will, instead of being a confederation, would be one state of all its citizens. But that is not, I think, a process that can be started right away. That needs a lot of time, and a confederation can be a phase toward that kind of state. And at least it would give the two groups rights, equal rights, a right of return, and equal dignity. Now, I don't know that we're going there. The direction that we're heading at is exactly the opposite one. And when you talk about a Jewish and democratic state, not only has democracy always been first and foremost for Jewish Israelis, in large part because for most of the existence of the state, it was an occupying state, that democracy, even for Jewish Israelis, was always limited. It was never full democracy. And you talk about labor, you know, the labor governments, which were unfortunately not for most of the existence of the state. They were until 1977, and then there were just a few short governments in between. Labor governments were very much part of that, of a state that did not have a healthy civil society. In large part also because of the treatment of the Arab minority in Israel itself. Between 1949 and 1966, all Arab citizens of Israel lived under military rule. Hypothetically, they lived in a democracy, but in reality, they did not have democratic rights. In theory, Israel was a democracy only between December 1966, when the military rule was lifted, and June 1967, when Israel took over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, which it had evicted in 1948. So, of course, you're right. When I talk about democracy, I'm talking about a vision. I think that there was more focus, more hearkening for democracy in Israel in past decades than there is now. And I think that the focus on a Jewish state has not only had the inevitable result of it being more ethnocentric and more violent toward its minorities, it's also ended up in it being more Jewish. Because when you say a Jewish state, do you mean a state for Jews or a Jewish state? It was always a state for Jews. It was also always an ideology, an ethno-national ideology. But the state has become, and society has become increasingly religious. And not simply religious, but religious in a particular way that is anti-democratic, anti-liberal, militant, messianic, in a way that will ensure the destruction of any remnants of democracy or liberal thinking or human rights in that country, not only for Arabs, but also for Jews.
Well, I think it's time to end this marvelous conversation, and I'm sad that we need to go home. And I thank you very much for your for the privilege of having you here, and we learn a lot. Thank you so much. Thank you. And, well, can finish now. You want to say anything, please? Lígia Bahia.
Muito obrigada, professor. Acho que nós estamos assim, fomos contemplados com uma possibilidade de compreensão, inclusive, de que nós também tenhamos dúvidas, né? Nós aqui no Brasil, nossas universidades são diferentes das universidades americanas, são diferentes das universidades em Israel, mas acho que a gente sai daqui dessa noite junto com você, assim, super. A gente está com muitas dúvidas e essas dúvidas elas são fundamentais para que a gente tenha uma universidade que não seja uma universidade tecnocrática, para que não seja essa universidade que a gente não quer. A gente não quer que o Brasil tenha essas universidades, embora a gente também, certamente, nós estamos caminhando aceleradamente para isso. Mas é mais acho que a gente sai daqui com a maior capacidade de pensar sobre nossos rumos, né? O que a gente pode fazer. Temos escolha. Obrigada, professor. E com várias advertências. E sabendo que nós temos escolha. Então, muito obrigada. E a gente espera que você volte, né? Nós queremos que você volte muitas vezes aqui para o Brasil, para que a gente, inclusive, consiga conversar mais, né? Consiga, que você contribua para que a gente também entenda melhor o nosso país, né? Que é muito violento. Obrigada.
Wow, it was really a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You know that I'm from the Jews, no?
Now you are?
Yes,
Well, it's been
like
hard
you.
here, right?
It has been very hard.
I hear that it's been difficult.